How do you feel about the people that say, why was Tupac repping the West Coast and he was from the East Coast?
I think people like when first of all, like for example, Ice T originally from New Jersey, but he represent the West Coast. Kurupt is from Philadelphia. He moved to LA when he was 16 years old, probably the same age that Pac moved to Oakland, but he represent the West Coast. And Pac, I believe, Pac, he never stopped saying he's from New York, but I believe the reason why he represented the West Coast is because his most impactful years as a young teenager until when he started becoming a young man and he started learning things as far as street codes and start certain ethics and certain way to carry himself. He learned that from the West Coast, and that's why he represented the West Coast. He felt more at home at the West Coast. But you got many artists. Xzibit is from Texas. You know what I mean? What's his name? 40 Glock is another artist. He's from Texas. But they all represent the West Coast and nobody say nothing. But when Pac do it, you know what I mean? It's a big problem like he's fronting. No, Pac really lived in Marin City. He lived in the ghetto, like in the hood, in the projects, in Oakland, in Marin City. And at the time of his life where, you know what I mean, people was, at 15, 16 years old. You know what I mean? It became something that he was able to learn certain things at that age, and it just stuck with him. You know.
I agree, man. But what people need to understand is that Tupac, he was born in New York. He loved New York, and he moved to Baltimore when he was still a kid. Then he left Baltimore when he was still in high school. Then he moved to the West Coast. But what people need to understand is that Tupac, he had no say-so on where he moved. He was still a kid at that
Yeah.
time. His mom was moving all these places, so he had no say-so.
It was out of his control. Yeah, it's not like he was moving it like hood hopping. You know what I mean? He had no other choice, and he didn't really settle until he got to L.A. When he got to, Oakland, he settled. He started having homies. You know what I mean? He started to know like he was able to settle down there. But he always tell the people he's originally from the East Coast. You know. But he represented the West Coast the same way Kurupt represented the West Coast, the same way Xzibit, the same way Ice T. These are people, the West Coast have a way, it's very impressionable that it leaves on it. I love LA. I'm from New Jersey, you know what I mean? And I would say I lived probably more of my life in LA than I lived in New Jersey. West Coast is, I love both. I love Jersey. I love LA. You know what I mean? I represent both. And I think Pac did the same thing. But of course, West Coast, and you got to look at Pac, man, how he felt like everybody was hating on him was from the East Coast. So when he got home, he like, man, I'm going against all these jokers. And I got my machine behind me, the West Coast. But also, that 15, 16 years old is a very, when it comes to 16, 17 years old, 15 years old as a teenager, these are the years that you are very impressible, where you very, you know what I mean, you can be molded easily, and you can get game, you know what I mean, you can really soak up game, and that's what he learned from the people in Oakland.
I seen an interview from Dash. Shout out to Dash, man. I like Dash, man, real one. But I seen an interview he did some years ago, and he said that Tupac, he was claiming Kurupt before he joined Death Row and started hanging out with Suge Knight and MOB.
Maybe he meant that at the beginning, Pac close, crew was a lot of Crips. He ran with a lot of Crips, Rated R from the 40s, Macadocious from the 40s, Big Sight from IVC. He had Manu and all of them. They was like from East Coast. He used to hang with a lot of Crips. You know what I mean? And probably when he went to Death Row, he started hanging with a lot of Bloods because now Suge bailed him out of prison. Most of Suge's security, his entourage are all Bloods. So that's how Pac was. You know what I mean? He never you know what I mean? He never really said, okay, now I'm a Blood. He still had, like Speedy. Speedy used to come around. He was a Crip. He had, Pac still was affiliated with Crips. I would say he was around Crips and Bloods. But when he went to Death Row, no doubt, he was more around the Pirus and Bloods. You know what I mean?
How do you feel about the people that say Suge Knight should have kept Tupac away from all the gang activity at Death Row?
I agree with that, definitely. I do agree that Suge, should have been smart enough to make sure his artist is not involved in any type of gang activity. You know what I mean? Because, Suge, he made history with that record label. You know what I mean? To come from Compton to have a company that's worth $300 million, you got to know how to adapt. You know what I mean? When we come from the hood, you know what I mean? You got to, look at Jay-Z, for example. He's a prime example, of how to adapt when it comes to business mind. I'm not talking about him personally. I don't know what he do personally. I don't know these things. But as far as business, he showed us how to adapt. He showed us that you can come from the bottom and you can be able to make it. You can put on a suit if you want to. You can speak. Like, that's how you're supposed to grow. You know what I mean? That's one of the reasons we try to get into the industry. Besides talent, we want to make it about the hood. But I think the mistake that Suge made is that he didn't know how to separate, you know what I mean, the streets from the boardroom. You know what I mean? And I think that's why, unfortunately, the record company failed, why it went down eventually. And that's how Pac died. You know what I mean? You want to be the furthest away. When you come from things like that you see, that we see in the neighborhood, we want to be the furthest away. Sometimes you be able to smell it coming a mile away. You know what I mean? When you come from the hood and you around these things, you're supposed to try your best to avoid it. So I think when people, you know, Suge should have kept that away from Pac. He should have kept it away from his record company. He should have took care of these dudes that was around him, like, you know, Trey and Buntry and all them dudes that's holding them down, and make sure that they also become leaders in the future and CEOs and business people, because he had the opportunity. You know what I mean? He had the opportunity.